Arthur Ashe was once at a party and a woman came up to him and started talking. She had no idea who he was, and she held a tennis racket in her hand and began to demonstrate how to hold the racket. The people around were cringing and were embarrassed, but Arthur Ashe just listened politely and patiently to her words. Maybe there are people in this audience who have never heard that name, Arthur Ashe. Just a very famous tennis player in the 60s and 70s. And he was also the very first African American player to make it big before the Williams sisters. He was a picture of poise and agility as a player. He was also the embodiment of grace and humility, as the story illustrates. Some of the qualities of a self-governed sage involves grace, poise, agility, and humility. The concept of asserting one's rights is the basis of our civilization. Yet the spiritual path informs us that our so-called rights have no meaning when one starts out even as a Shravaka, a listener on the path. Light on the path informs us very early on, and that power that the disciple shall covet is that which shall make him appear as nothing in the eyes of men. The second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita starts with Krishna looking at Arjuna's tear-filled eyes, Ashru Purne Kulekshanam, and explains that the Supreme Spirit is immortal and that we are deluded by the senses. The Spirit does not kill or cause to be killed. He explains that as a Kshatriya, it is his duty to fight and he needs to be equal-minded in performing his duty, not acting for any special reward. Arjuna, somewhat calmer, asks questions about what are the characteristics of a sage. That is when Krishna explains that a wise man, a sage, is indifferent to pleasure or pain, and at the same time is able to control the senses and restrain them, part of which leads to grace and humility that we heard about in the story. But there is more to a self-governed sage. As William Kwanjad says in his translation of the Bhagavad Gita, a man is said to be confirmed in spiritual knowledge when he forsaketh every desire that enters his heart, and of himself is happy and content in the big self through the little self. His mind is undisturbed in adversity. He is happy and contented in prosperity, and he is a stranger to anxiety, fear, and anger. When in every condition he receives each event, whether favorable or unfavorable, with an equal mind, which neither likes nor dislikes, his wisdom is established. And having met good or evil, neither rejoiceth at the one, nor is cast down by the other. This verse's last few words contain an apt simile. Like the tortoise, he can draw in all his senses and restrain them from their wanted purpose. Krishna ends his description of a self-governed sage with this sentence: what is night to those who are unenlightened is as day to his gaze. What seems as day is known to him as night, the night of ignorance. And Arjuna listens, asking a few questions now and then to clarify his doubts. Again, he is showing signs of humility and a willingness to learn. He is an archer with great skills, but now he comes without arrogance or pride, having reached a critical phase in his life, because he's confused about what he needs to do based on what he has believed to be his duty. What is duty? What is the right thing to do? Don Miguel Ruiz, in his book, The Four Agreements, lays out 4 promises we keep with ourselves. Number 1, be impeccable with your word. 2, Don't take anything personally. 3, don't make assumptions. And 4, always do your best. These 4 agreements talk about what your duty in life is all about. Love, using your energy wisely, understanding and avoiding needless suffering by being immune to the opinion of others, showing courage and honesty in your communications with others, and finally, doing your duty to the best of your ability and avoiding regret and self-abuse. Closely examining these arguments laid out by the ancient Toltecs of Mexico, the current day Toltec, Don Miguel Ruiz, is basically talking about the development of the paramitas. True love is dana. Using energy wisely is shila and chanti and virya. While in the process of not taking things personally, you are exhibiting viraga. Aiming for the best leads one to dhyana and finally to prajna. A self-governed sage is he who exhibits all these qualities. A self-governed sage is not worried about external forces and works with nature and not against it. The Bhagavad Gita uses a different approach, yet the message is not too different. The title of this book can be translated as the celestial song. Like a song, the main message is repeated in various ways using the different schools of philosophy prevalent in that period. Unlike Western classical music, where the crescendo comes in the end, the Eastern music brings the kingly knowledge and the kingly mystery along with the Vishwarupa or the divine form, crescendo somewhat in the middle. The rest of the chapters repeat elaborate, riff like a piece of jazz or orchestral music, repositioning the qualities of a self-governed sage in other chapters, for example, besides what we hear in the second chapter, and finally ends with the middle note of the scale. This is where in the final chapter, Krishna confirms that Arjuna has cleared his doubts. Pandit Bhavani Shankar was a student of the Theosophical Society during H.P. Blavatsky's time and subsequently joined the Bombay ULT in the 20th century. His book, The Doctrine of the Bhagavad Gita, talks about the characteristics of a sage. He looks at chapter 4 of the Bhagavad Gita, devotion through spiritual knowledge, jnana, karma, sannyasa yoga, and focuses on a few verses in the middle of the chapter, namely verse 19 through verses 24. He states, the 19th verse contains the general definition of a sage. He whose engagements are all devoid of desires and purposes, and whose actions have been burnt by the fire of wisdom, him the wise call a sage. William Quan Judge, in his rendition of the Bhagavad Gita, states, those who have spiritual discrimination call him wise, whose undertakings are all free from desire, for his actions are consumed in the fire of knowledge. So whether you call it actions burnt by the fire of wisdom or actions consumed in the fire of knowledge, the Sanskrit crisply calls it Jnanani Dagda Karmanam. Fire purifies, transforms, and elevates. Bhavani Shankar elucidates. When a man becomes impersonal, that is, when he has realized his self, all desires and thoughts of the personal self depart from him. But still, there is the idea of self and not self, which is the root ignorance. And unless this is dispelled by the light of Ishvara, the seed of karma is not burnt out. In a sage, even the seed of karma is burnt out. Hence, his actions have no binding power. because they cannot sprout and grow any longer. Therefore, are his actions said to be burnt by the fire of wisdom. Bhavani Shankar continues. He states there are two orders of sages laid out in the 5 verses that follow. The first one seeks liberation and still stays around, even though they do not serve humanity, but engage in action to set an example to other men and practice true sacrifice like King Janaka did. We are going to talk about King Janaka a little later. The second kind of sage is very rare to find because he lives an obscure life and devotes his life to the enlightenment of his race, follows the Kuan Yin pledge, which states, never will I seek nor receive private nor individual salvation. Never will I enter into final peace alone, but forever and everywhere will I live and strive for the redemption of every creature throughout the world from the bonds of conditioned existence. So these verses may seem at first sight to be meaningless repetition according to Bhavani Shankar. They are talking about renunciation and liberation, he says. The voice of the silence, as most of us know, talks very clearly about the two parts in the second fragment. Gautama Buddha is referred to as the embodiment of renunciation, the heart doctrine. Mr. B.P. Wadia, in his studies in the voice of the silence, quotes from the Theosophical Glossary by H.P. Blavatsky, page 67, referring to the Buddha Siddhartha, or Gautama Buddha. Esoteric teachings claim that he renounced nirvana and gave up the Dharmakaya vesture to remain a Buddha of compassion within the reach of the miseries of this world. And then he states, to acquire the wisdom necessary for that path takes time and a special effort. And this is possible through chelaship, not as it is understood in the religious and mystical world, but as it is understood in occultism and esoteric philosophy. A special kind of training and development is necessary to walk the way of renunciation. It is the renouncing not only of the world of matter, but also the world of spirit, not of life in form only, but also of life eternal. It is freedom from the bondage of passion, which every emancipated soul enjoys, but further, it is the acceptance of the bondage of compassion, which the mukta, the one who goes towards liberation, does not accept. But not all self-governed sages take the path of renunciation, and they still have to go through several stages of discipline, pain, and suffering. Damodar Mavalankar, another student of theosophy during HPB's time, was a regular contributor to the Theosophist during the late 19th century. In 5 years of theosophy under the chapter Contemplation, he lays out some of the qualities of a Raja Rishi, a kingly sage or philosopher king, and gives the example of King Janaka of the solar race. He starts out by talking about students of theosophy who read Patanjali's yoga aphorisms and dabble in contemplation without achieving anything substantial, because wallowing in the mire of exotericism, he knows not what it is to live in the world and yet be not of the world. In other words, to guard big self against little self is an almost incomprehensible axiom for the profane. The Hindu ought to know better from the life of Janaka, who, although a reigning monarch, was yet styled Rajarishi and is said to have attained nirvana. And here he tells a story, which I will use his words again. Hearing of his, King Janaka's widespread fame, a few sectarian bigots went to his court to test his yoga power. As soon as they entered the courtroom, the king, having read their thoughts, a power which every chela attains at a certain stage, gave secret instructions to his officials to have a particular street in the city lined on both sides by dancing girls singing the most voluptuous songs. He then had some ghadas, pots, filled with water up to the brim, so that the least shake would be likely to spill their contents. The wiseacres, each with a full ghada, pot on his head, were ordered to pass along the street surrounded by soldiers with drawn swords to be used against them if even so much as a drop of water were allowed to run over. The poor fellows, having returned to the palace after successfully passing the test, were asked by the king adept what they had met with in the street they were made to go through. With great indignation, they replied that the threat of being cut to pieces had so much worked upon their minds that they had thought of nothing but the water on their heads, and the intensity of their attention did not permit them to take cognizance of what was going on around them. Then Janaka told them that on the same principle, they could easily understand that although being outwardly engaged in managing the affairs of the state, he could at the same time be an occultist. He too, while in the world, was not of the world. In other words, his inward aspirations had been leading him on continually to the goal in which his whole inner self was concentrated. I just love Damodar Mavalankar's words. They're all so 19th century style English. In the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 5, verse 10, Krishna says, "Whoever in acting dedicates his actions to the Supreme Spirit and puts aside all selfish interest in their result is untouched by sin, even as the leaf of the lotus is unaffected by the waters." Or one could say that King Janaka is like the lotus leaf, living in the waters of samsara and yet untouched by it. Padma Patram Ivambasa. Duty and devotion seem to go hand in hand. If you look at a Sanskrit dictionary that defines these two words, dharma and yoga, dharma has both the meaning duty and devotion, and meanwhile yoga, besides being defined as union, also means endeavor. And Mr. W.Q. Judge calls it devotion. The Theosophical Glossary by H.P. Blavatsky, page 381, while defining the word yoga as a school of philosophy, first, also gives a second definition of this word as follows: the practice of meditation as a means of leading to spiritual liberation. Psycho-spiritual powers are obtained thereby, and induced ecstatic states lead to the clear and correct perception of the eternal truths in both the visible and the invisible universes. The Bhakti cult, Bhakti is also another word for devotion. The Bhakti cult was prevalent in India during the 7th through the 17th century CE. It started in the south of India and spread to the northern areas of the country later. There are not a lot of women saints that are mentioned in this period. I shall focus on two of them, and I have shown their pictures in my flyer. And we will try to talk about them to illustrate their devotion and assimilation with the Supreme in the Vaishnava tradition. And according to the above definition of yoga, also leading to the clear and correct perception of the eternal truths. Andal was born Kodai in the southern state of what is now called Tamil Nadu around the 7th or 8th century. In a small city called Srivalipattur in Tamil Nadu lived a great devotee of Vishnu. His name was Vishnu Chittar, which literally means devotee of Vishnu. Every morning he would collect the flowers from his garden and weave them into a garland for the Lord and adorn the deity in the temple. One day, while plucking the flowers, he found a little baby girl in the garden and took the baby as his own and raised her. He took her as a gift from God and named her Kodai. Vishnu Chittar raised her with love and constantly told her stories about Krishna and Rama, incarnations of the Lord Vishnu. The little one grew up always thinking about the Lord. One day, after her father had stepped out after weaving the garland, Kodai tried it on. When anything is made for the Lord, whether it is food or flowers or ornaments of any kind, no one is supposed to touch it. And this action of hers would have been considered a sacrilege. Kodai continued to do this every single day. One day, when the father took the garland to the temple, the priest noticed a piece of hair on the garland and he was furious with the father. Vishnu Chittar came home bewildered and very sad, and he could not sleep that night. The next morning, he wove his garland and decided to come into the room a little earlier than usual, and was shocked to see his daughter wearing the garland around her neck. He was horrified, and he went back to the garden to pick new flowers and take a fresh garland to the Lord, leaving the child crying at home. However, that night he had a dream where Lord Vishnu appeared to him and said that he only needed the garland that Kodai wore around her because it contained the scent of her pure devotion. So that changed everything. Kodai was renamed Andal, one who ruled the Lord, and her worn garland was always taken to the temple. Andal refused to get married, saying that her Lord was her life, singing the praises of Lord Krishna. Even today, in the month of Margari, which is the Tamil month between December and January, there are songs, they're all dedicated to her songs that month. It's called Tiruppavai in South India. She ends each song by invoking the Lord to wake up. Then many centuries later, around the 16th century, we have the story of Meera from Rajasthan, a northern state in India. She grew up in a small village called Merta. Unlike Andal, who came from a very simple family, Meera was a princess. As a young child, her mother playfully told her that she would wed Lord Krishna. Unfortunately, both her parents died when she was young, and she was raised by her grandfather. She grew up singing the praises of Lord Krishna and was raised with love and affection. But like most girls of her time, she was married against her wishes to a prince from a neighboring town. She continued to be a devotee of the Lord and refused to have an intimate relation with her betrothed. Her in-laws were not too happy and insisted that she should behave like a proper woman. But Meera was focused, and so all her thoughts and devotion was on the supreme, ineffable one, Krishna. Several attempts were made to kill her, but she miraculously evaded all of this, and finally she left for Varanasi, the sacred city near the Ganges River, and soon she attained her abode with the Lord. Her songs are also very famous in the north. One of them talks about wearing the ghunguru or the anklets and dancing away in ecstasy, almost like the Sufi saints. Both Mirabai, as she was later called, and Andal exhibited the one-pointedness right from childhood that allowed them to be merged with the Paramatma finally. B.P. Wadia, in The Virtuous Mind from the Studies in the Voice of the Silent, says, if the practice of bodily brahmacharya, which is celibacy, is a difficult undertaking, much more difficult is soul celibacy, unfoldment from within without is the law in Brahmacharya. Inner psycho-spiritual celibacy makes the outer psychophysiological celibacy possible. In the last and 18th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, verse 72, Krishna says to Arjuna, "Hast thou heard all this, O son of Prita, with mind one-pointed? Has the delusion of thought that arose from ignorance been removed, O Dhananjaya?" This one-pointedness is also expressed in Patanjali's Yoga aphorisms. This is what William Quan Judge states in his translation of the Yoga Sutras aphorisms in Book 2, verse 12. When the mind, after becoming fixed upon a single object, has ceased to be concerned in any thought about the condition, qualities, or relation of the thing thought of, but is absolutely fastened upon the object itself, it is then said to be intent upon a single point, a state technically called ekagrata. Let me end my talk with some ideas that Mr. B.P. Wadia, again from the Voice of the Studies or in the Voice of the Silence, the chapter is called The Mind of the Renouncer, states, "The ordinary man has for his horizon a street. His insight is surface deep, and the points of his magnetic compass draw him to his appetites. He lives in his sense-created state, which looks to him like a real world, but which is not any of the 7 worlds of rest eternal. His mind made subservient to his senses, and his senses to his appetites, he goes from death to death. However, the man who has begun to live, who recognizes that life being probationary, afflictions are opportunities, looks beyond his street. Modern education does give him some breadth of vision, but not the depth. And therefore, the gap between his knowledge and his practice, between his mental and his moral life, between his sacred beliefs and his secular deeds. Theosophy educates the human mind to gain depth, to see below the surface, to penetrate into the very kernel of form. Sorry. When the horizon of the student is broadened, when the insight of the practitioner has deepened, and therefore he has begun to live, he must secure the magnetic compass of the higher life. In navigation, by means of the magnetic compass, the directive force of Earth, the great magnet upon a freely suspended needle is used, and it is indispensable. Equally indispensable, nay, more so, is the corresponding instrument to navigate the ocean of samsara. The depth of insight develops viveka, discrimination, and for the learning soul, that aspect of it which enables him to select ideas and aphorisms, which under karma and for his particular stage are necessary. The points of his magnetic compass show him the way to Sat, the truth. It is for the human mind to maintain the breadth and depth gained by not allowing the desires and fancies to exert their power of suggestion to draw him away to Maya's realm. This has to be achieved by the mind blending itself with the soul. This comes actually from the mind is like a mirror, it gathers dust. It's from that piece. From the pre-Chela stage, the seeker after truth becomes a Chela where he practices the vow of silence to listen, learn, and ponder deeply. Then he applies noetic ethics to guide him towards becoming a sage. The path is steep, dangerous, and full of temptations. Yet there are those few who reach the mountaintop. Thank you.
Thank you, Shobha.
Thank you.
You'll all have to unmute yourself when you got a questioner there, Shobha.
I do.
Yeah, Judy.
Judy. Hi,
Hi,
Judy.
Shobha, thank you for a wonderful presentation. It really should be published as an essay
Oh my
on
God.
the
Thank
Gita.
you.
You might consider sending it to Vidya or some journal, but I guess my question is a rather broad one, because it really focuses on the idea in the Gita that the self-governed sage forsakes every desire that enters his heart. Yet paradoxically, the sage then is desiring not to desire. So I once heard Nini Iyer explain this, that this means that you desire nothing for your personal self. And like Mirabai, you're focused on Krishna alone. And that's the only way that you're going to get to the top of the mountain, is to be devoted to me alone as the object, I think the Judge
Right.
translation says.
Right.
So would you agree with that interpretation?
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better. Yeah. To desire, the desire is to desire nothing. And the one pointedness, that's why I thought that was so beautiful with both Mirabai and Andal, because their focus was on the Lord, nothing else mattered. And there's also this other piece about the celibacy that B.P. Wadia talks about, the two kinds of celibacy, and not just the physical, physiological, but the inner celibacy. We talk about students of theosophy not trying to eat the flesh of animals or whatever, and trying not to do this, that, and the other. But what about the inner animal qualities that we have of aggrandizement and all that? Why should we blame the poor animals, right? It's humans who behave worse than animals. So I think that's why it's beautiful, what B.P. Wadia talks about, the two kinds of celibacy. So there are so many ways in which we have to clean up ourselves.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Judy. That was very nice. Thank you.
Mm.
Yes, David.
Oh, just on that point, this isn't an exact quote, but HPB refers to, we have to get rid of the meat of the mind.
It's a good one. Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting.
Yes. Yeah, we always talk about external things, but there's so much work that needs to be done. And those 4 articles that B.P. Wadia wrote in the Voice of the Silence, studies in the Voice of the Silence, are just so, he goes so deep into how we need to be working on our desires and our senses, how we get caught up. He talks about something about it being like a bazaar where we are attracted to all kinds of things, I keep thinking about the Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, with the attraction to, when the brother goes in, when Alibaba's brother goes in, spends too long a time there, And I always think about what H.P. Blavatsky says in The Voice of the Silence about don't linger in the hall of learning, right? So I always think of Alibaba's brother. Yeah, it's a good one.
You got a fan here.
Yes, hi, Desiree.
You have to unmute yourself, Desiree.
Thank you so much, Shobha. What a collection. Oh my gosh, all those stories.
Yeah, it's all stories today.
All stories, and I love it because when it gets down to it, we're all storytellers, aren't we?
Mhm.
I really appreciated the reference to musical movements when I'm speaking about the progress that is occurring in the Bhagavad Gita in all of our lives. When you talk about the crescendos and the adagios, I mean, you can actually staccatos and it goes on, and it's just the allegros, the when you were saying that, I was thinking, I wonder if the Kali Yuga is a kind of allegro where it's just a
Right.
you know.
Yes. Yes.
But anyways, I just wanted to, share my appreciation of your work today. It's just so beautiful to listen to your voice as well.
Thank you, Desiree. Thank you. Yeah, I just love that thing about the Gita, because Gita means song, and so it's a song. And one of the things my father told me years ago is that Western music ends with a crescendo. Our music doesn't end with a crescendo. It comes down to the middle note. It always comes down to the middle note when you end a song in South Indian classical music, especially, even in North Indian. I think I should ask Jeffrey, who's an expert on that. But yeah, it's fascinating. I never thought of it that way, but it's true. Western music ends with a crescendo always.
How about Jim? Can you take a question from Jim?
Yeah, sure, Jim. Hi, Jim.
Hello, thank you so much for an exquisite presentation. I certainly add my gratitude and thanks to your presentation, Shobha.
Thank you.
I do have a question though, going back to Judy's point about when Krishna, the sage is one who renounces every desire which enters into his heart. And one can understand because looking at it in a slightly on the positive side of it, such a being would be attuned to the cosmic will, we might say, so that his instantiation on any given occasion is really an expression of a deeper kind of eros, a deeper kind of cosmic will. I remember Confucius remarks that when you get to the highest level, you're spontaneously enacting the purest kind of wish, a celestial wish. But now I want to come back though, but when we say that it's renunciation of every desire is every personal desire, I think that needs some clarification, because if one desires to eat, or one desires a meal, or one desires any multitude of things, all of which are necessary and needed, and we can imagine a whole scale of hierarchy of different kinds of desires, which we would say are very human, very necessary. So the renunciation then seems to me to take a meaning that's a little richer and subtler. It's not the having of the desire. Certain desires, yes, are totally undesirable, but still, desires and renunciation isn't necessarily renouncing. It's seeing the particular desire in perspective, and in terms of the values that we cherish, and in terms of what we know to be needed and necessary or our duty. So I just wanted to be sure that that seems to make sense to you, that renunciation here is not necessarily saying that any desire that's personal is not good, because we need certain kinds of personal desires. It's a different point about renunciation.
I think I look at it more like you examine your desires and see how much is too much, right? That's the thing. I think as a living human being, we cannot stop eating. We cannot do all that. But the path, for example, there are so many stages to this, isn't it?
Yes.
It's the pre-chela, then the chela, then there is the chela stage is a long stage, and that is the process where you go through under examining. And here again, BP Wadia talks about examining your desires, sitting and examining yourself. What do these desires mean? Years ago, I read a short story by Tolstoy called How Much Land Does a Man Need?
Oh, yes, that's a classic story.
I loved that story. I just made such a big impression on me when you hear it's just 6 feet, right? And I thought, wow, how much land does a man need? And 6 feet it's all he needs to be buried, right? And so this whole thing about how much do we need anything, here's the thing, we have different kinds of desires. Some of us like to eat, and where do we stop? Okay, this is so good, this piece of chocolate is so good, I'm going to have another one and another one, right? And that's what I mean. It starts with those things, with something that we eat, and then buying. Some people just buy. I know people who have about hundreds of pairs of shoes. I'm like, I'm also guilty of that. I like shoes. And then I'm like, no, I don't need it. Why do I need it? So it's just that, how much can we start there. And I think it gets deeper than that. I think you start with something like that, and it slowly gets deeper. And like I said, it's like BP Odwawadi also says, it's not just the outer celibacy, but the inner celibacy.
Yeah.
So everything, desires, there are so many different kinds of desires, right?
Yes.
So I think the desire that we want our children to be the best and do the best. And what if they don't? How do we deal with that?
Yeah.
Are we supposed to get disappointed and completely lose it? What did our parents expect us to do? My mother wanted me to be a singer, and I didn't become a singer. She said, I'm so disappointed you never became a singer. So, it's okay. You do what you have to. And you also, I think that desires need to be really looked at deeply.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Got a
Yes,
question?
Monica. And then I think Ken. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Shobha. This was just wonderful. It was so gorgeous, beginning to end. And you
Thank
graced us with your devotion by way of that beautiful sari you're wearing. And I thought that was lovely too. It just is such the feeling of it washed over me, and I appreciate it. And in particular, the talking about Mirabai, I think was very important. We don't, Dr. Judy mentioned this as well. We don't hear about women and their attainment on this path that as often maybe as we should. And so it was wonderful to hear about her. And it was also wonderful to hear about her in the context of your presentation, because I've heard about Mirabai before, but it was in such a spirit of her abandon and her the fierceness of her devotion, but also the focus and concentration she had. So there was a melodic sort of viewpoint about her, but I had never until now coupled that with this idea of one-pointedness and devotion. And for this student, that was really important. But overall, just magnificent. And thank you very much.
Thank you. I've always felt that there are a lot of women saints out there, not just in India, but we hear about it in the Catholic, we talk about Sorwana I mean, Ken might know who I'm talking about. Sorwana was sister, and also about the descalzados, the ones who didn't were barefooted. Yeah. So, I mean, there were a lot of stories about in the Christian faith too, about women saints. We don't hear enough about it because that's the way it is. We do hear more about the men saints.
Yeah.
In fact, Andal was one of the 12 Alvars who were all male. 11 were male, and she was the only female, Andal. from the south. They were all considered to have attained salvation, nirvana, and they were all male, and she was in. Yeah, you don't hear much, but there are a lot, and their stories need to be told.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Ken, did you have a question?
Yes. First, the Disalcids ones, the ones without shoes, were started by Saint Teresa de Avila in Spain. Yes.
Right.
And this was just a wonderful, as others have said, a wonderful presentation, kind of like a song in itself when you went over it. I was curious about a little bit more about when BP Wadia talks about the magnetic compass of the ordinary life and when we're caught up in all the samsaras, and then magnetizing ourselves to this one pointedness and that state of meditation you mentioned, the
Ekagrata.
Ekagrata, yes. And if that kind of magnetization has anything at all in your thinking or reading or BP Wadia's writings with that French mesmerism and hypnosis, since that's sort of a curious thing, Jonathan, I've got to come back and forth about. What about hypnosis? And does that have anything to do with the magnetization and this kind of meditational practice?
Right. Yeah. Alignment, isn't it? It's an alignment. And H.P. Blavatsky talks a lot about mesmer, especially the Isis and Veil, she mentions. She talks about a lot of that. And I think it's important to understand what's going on. They were all dismissed. A lot of them were dismissed by science. And in the first volume of the Isis, she's focusing on the scientists, right? So she talks about Mesmer. She talks about so many others who were able to do things, cure people. It wasn't, hypnosis has been a little more problematic because it's a question of controlling the will of a person, So whereas mesmerism has been done, and these were all, she says, thaumaturgists, they were all pure of mind and pure of soul. So there was no ulterior motive for personal gain. So it was to help others. It was that's important. And she emphasizes that.
And why I ask that is that sometimes I practice what I've been calling self-hypnosis. And I'm wondering if that is perhaps a type of meditation that could be going along this pathway towards getting these inner meditational states, the self-hypnosis.
I wish I knew the answer to that. I don't. Maybe somebody here who knows more can answer that.
Thank you.
I don't know, Ken. Yes. Thank you, Ken.
Desiree, her hand is up again.
Sorry.
Because she believes in cycles.
No, I was just thinking about the quality of desire, and I'm wondering if it has more to do with the attachment to it rather than the desire itself, because it seems like that's how we create habits. And those, ruts, we get into those ruts is because we chase the sensation of the desire or the desired thing. So we're actually trying to recreate that sensation over and over and over again. And that's chasing.
Yeah,
it's our attachment to that.
Like an addiction. You're talking about.
So when he's talking about personal desire to survive, that's completely different. But when you talk about, when a person's obsessed and has to have more and more and more and more, they're chasing that sensation, which is really quite an addiction.
Yes.
We become
it's an addiction.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
it's an addiction.
Sickness. It really is a sickness.
Yes.
Mental sickness.
It is. An obsession. Yes. Yeah. But for us, the way, I think it's really wonderful it's really wonderful how BP Wadia in these studies in the Voice of the Silence keeps talking about step by step, how you go about the process of dealing with this. That's what I like. I mean, we know all this, right? As students of theosophy, we've seen it everywhere. We've read about it in our devotional books. We've seen H.P. Blavatsky talk about it. We've seen William Conjudge talk about it. We've seen Robert Crosby talk about it. But it's that step by step explaining what it's doing to you and how you need to go about it and how you eradicate it, right? That is what is where the self-examination comes in, where you sit when you're spending time, if you can, each day, at the end of the day, what could I have done differently? Like a good teacher always does after finishing a class, right? That didn't go right. How could I have changed it? What could I have said better, right? So it's the same thing with examining ourselves every single day. What could I have done better? What did I do well? What did I do like an idiot? Okay, so I mean, we go through that, right, every day.
Yeah, but I wouldn't call myself an idiot, or you shouldn't call yourself an idiot ever.
No, what I mean is, again, I'm looking at what the voice of the silence says. You've got to be really like the mango, hard as the mango's seed on your faults and soft as the pulp to others. So I'm not saying you're belittling yourself, which is another thing he talks about. No self-abuse, right? No self-abuse, I agree. But it's more a question of idiotic in the sense of silly. I don't mean it in, oh, what an idiot, silly, that was silly. I shouldn't have done that, right? Okay, does that make it better, Desiree?
You always make it better.
Well,
Thank you.
David,
Anybody else? No.
David's got his hand up.
David, okay, hi, David.
Okay, yeah, hi again. When Jim asked that question, starting about desire and what we've been talking about, I was thinking that's that dichotomy or kind of irony that, at least on the surface in the Gita, about the difference between inaction and action.
Right.
When it's proper to act and not act. And I was thinking, one of the early in your talk, you spoke of those 4 or 5 qualities like grace, poise,
right.
humility,
right.
and agility.
Right,
which
right,
I thought
right.
is a very interesting one in terms of action, because the Gita points out to us that there is necessary action. And that's what we must act upon.
Right.
And then just one last thought in my mind on that.
Please.
It is so interesting in the voice when we all know this so well. Inaction in a deed of mercy is action in a deadly sin. So we're always acting in one sense.
Exactly.
Yeah,
yes. And that agility also comes in the paramitas with virya, energy. Energy. Yes. So I just thought that it was very interesting that this book somebody gave me for my birthday, The 4 Agreements. I just love it, by this person from Mexico who talks about, how you need to live. I mean, everybody presents things in different ways, but they all come to the same things that we know in theosophy. You can reduce them to the same things. I thought about it and I said, oh my God, this sounds like the paramitas. I mean, they're all there. It's just being expressed in a different way. But they all say the same thing. Like H.P. Blavatsky used to say, all religions are the same esoterically. They're all giving the same message. And so I think that's very nice, that action in action, all these pairs of opposites, they seem like opposing each other, but they're really quite aligned and united in that. Yeah.
It's interesting to build a little bit on what David was saying. That Pythagoras, philosophical teachings to members of his community, he stressed the importance of sophrosine, or what's also been called at times temperance. But he was getting to the importance of a sense of proportion and measure in what you were doing in terms of both thought, speech, and action. You had to bring a sense of perspective. And that kind of BP Wadi kind of examination leads you to making a refinement, a discrimination. My wish for this, what really is the wish, what it is one is looking for, what is it that is a desirable end. So you can do this kind of analysis and you get a better sense of the significance of it, and you can kind of deal with measure and proportion in your actions. Now, what is also interesting is when you look at the Socratic dialogues, the great Diotima, the one who taught Socrates, actually, who lived up in the remote hills, the priestess, who apparently was quite a remarkable being, but she says there is no desire higher than the rational desire for immortality. Now there you have desire transforming itself endlessly from something simple to something very profound. And in all cases, we have to have a sense of perspective and an understanding of the requirements that come with that kind of desire, because that is a very high level of a wish. And when desires become aspirations or wishes, so there's a whole hierarchy, so to speak, that's reaching up to the purest kind of wish, of altruism, of compassion, so that we have quite a range of things. But I think what David's getting to, renunciation is helpful, because even the finest wish, there has to be an element of renunciation in it, because it has to harmonize with the good of the whole. And that's why we can never predict outcomes or be attached to them, because the way in which karma works for the harmony of the whole at any given time is beyond our immediate grasp unless we are a sage. Then we understand what Crosby says, doing the right thing at the right time to the right person the right way is ultimate form of wisdom in action, of skill in action. Anyway, that's just a thought.
Thank you, Jim. That was really very good, very informative. Thank you.
Yes,
So
ma'am.
I think I have a question that kind of follows through on that. You know how in our Gita class, shameless plug here. Hey, by the way, anybody who wants to come to a Gita class and doesn't know about one more that there are out there, our San Diego Lodge on Zoom, and it actually goes year round. We have a class in the Gita. It's a 1 o'clock California time, and it's the same link as you click on to get to this. So right now we're in chapter 10. So anyway, now you know how we do in our Gita class, Shobha, and we say, well, what's up with the sequence here, right? And why is this before that? You know, sometimes we have fun with that. Not like we're taking ourselves too seriously or anything, but it's fun. And you did something a little bit with that when you said that in the second chapter, Krishna is able to get Arjuna to kind of calm down, right? And then as soon as Arjuna calms down, he says, wait a minute, what's a Muni like, right? How does he sit? How does he act? What does he do, he or she? And then it's interesting, well, the way Jim was saying it was that basically the next chapter talks about action and what this, I was just wondering if you could kind of talk about that a little bit, if you have any thoughts about the juxtaposition of the self-governed sage in relation to the chapters.
You know, this is why I said it's a Gita, right? It's a song. So
Yeah.
it a lot of repetition, right? And the same ideas come in different forms depending on at what stage Arjuna is, right?
Mhm.
So initially he needs to be calmed down.
Mhm.
So he gives him a lot of practical, information, and then it slowly builds up. So I think he needs to also explain to him what action is, because he's confused about what his duty is, right?
Yes, yeah.
So to spend time talking about action.
Mhm.
But I think with time, you see that all of a sudden, as we are now in the 10th chapter. It is so profound what
Mhm.
he's doing.
Mhm.
It constantly reminds me of the proem in The Secret Doctrine, where H.P. Blavatsky is talking about the absolute, and from that, the differentiation. You know, it's like, wow. And then he talks about the planetary spirits, you
Mhm.
know, when he talks about the gods and everything. So it's fascinating how, occultism is being divulged. He's ready now for the kingly mystery, right?
Mhm.
But initially, but then when does it start? 9th chapter, when he says, unto thee who findeth no fault, right?
Mhm.
He has to wait till he's beyond judgment, beyond nitpicking, no
Mhm.
more of nitpicking. Because what does he say? He says, oh, is it in the 3rd or the 4th chapter where he says, how could you have taught them because you were born just now?
Yeah.
And he says, and I have gone through so many. So, all that nitpicking is stopped now because he's.
Uh-huh.
So I think it's beautiful when you look at it's funny, I've read the Gita so many times, but being with all of you and discussing it, it just opens up the mind. And I think it's, I can also be a plug for the Gita and let others know it's a great way of learning, because we are learning from each other. Everybody has so much to give in those classes. And it's very rich. It's a rich environment to learn.
That's
Yeah.
an incredible class. Incredible class. And I don't think any of us does any big reading project beforehand. We just crash the class, show up and start. I mean, maybe we could or should, but we just show up, it's in the middle of the day, at least for Californians, 4 o'clock for the back east people, but
Yeah.
you just show up and you just, the verses are just so rich in and of themselves. And we only get through like 3 each
Yeah.
time, but they're just so rich, so. And there's 700 verses. So obviously we don't get very far in relation to the whole book. So,
Yeah. Well, you know what they say, Jonathan, the Gita is the original self-help book.
yeah. Yeah, you don't need that whole section in the bookstore anymore.
Yeah, right.
Yes, Anthony.
Shobha,
Yes.
could you please tell us a little bit about the importance of silence and perhaps a vow of silence for one day? I don't know if any of the attendees know, but tomorrow, July 10th, for the followers of Meher Baba, they keep one day of silence in honor of his 44 years of silence that began on July 10th, 1925, until he dropped his body on January 30th, 1969. So I was just speaking to someone today, and I was saying, I'm going to attempt this tomorrow, but you're supposed to go out into the world, but how do you maintain silence in your dealings in the outside world? So I was just thinking, I'm just going to hole up in my apartment for one day and just text. But then that's speaking with your mind. So I'm just wondering about silence in general. What is your take on silence and the importance of it?
I think I just like that's why I started with Arthur Ashe. That silence I liked, He didn't want to brag and say, hey, why are you talking to me about all this? I'm a tennis player, I know all this. He just listened, right? I mean, talk about that's beautiful. I mean, what more do we need? I think it's this understatedness. It's not this Uriah Heep kind of humility we are talking about, we are talking about real humility. Humility is very difficult. It is, I think we all have a lot of pride within us. We say, oh, I did a great job, But I think it's very hard for us to silence ourselves and just stop and think, So that's the way I look at silence. It's also a question of listening to somebody else, there's a lot of that. We talk about active listening a lot. And, when we talk conflict resolution too, they talk about active listening to each other. Why are we all fighting all over the world today? Really? Are we listening to anybody? We're not listening to anybody. We're just fighting like crazy. Oh, I hate this person. I can't stand that. That's all we are doing. Where is there time for reflection to see what's going on? How can we resolve problems? The whole thing about conflict resolution it's a big thing now in schools, because there's so much going on in schools with, kids fighting with each other, whether it's in the classroom or in the big place where they sit and eat, dining room or whatever, there's constant conflict. And then, of course, all the big guys, all the grown-up guys are fighting like crazy all over the world. So I think silence would be so good, wouldn't it? To just stop and smell the roses and stop and think what's going on. Mm-hmm. So I think we all need to be doing it in our daily lives. For example, a simple example is when somebody says something who's close to you and they say something that you don't like, you don't have to retaliate. But how many times have I bit my tongue and stopped? Very rarely, right? I'm talking about myself. It's easy to say all this, but it's like so hard to live. You talked about texting, right? Oh my God, the amount of texting we all do, so I think, yeah, it's Twitter, Facebook, whatever, take all that. It's all texting and talking and jabbering away, right?
Right, but that's your mind jabbering. So how do you pair, a verbal silence with mental silence? I don't know, but I'm going to give it a try. I'll let you guys know next time I see you.
I think it like BP Warrior talked about it. If the inner comes, then the outer comes naturally. He says, yeah.
It just,
Yeah. Yes, Jim. Was it Jim?
I think Maluka's I was going to respond to something you said, but Maluka's had her hand up for quite a while. So
see that.
Sorry.
Hi, Maluka.
Hi, Shobha. You are wonderful. You're one of my favorite speakers, to tell you the truth.
Thank
You're
you.
very inspiring, and you have so much knowledge. You're a good example. I'm learning, trying to learn. Regarding silence, what it came to mind is that, I learn when I go outside to my yard, and I think I close my mind to my own thoughts, and I just observe nature, and I just close my eyes, and I just let the wind caress my face. And then I just hear the birds, I hear the sounds. I try to connect with nature. And I think that gives me peace. And then I feel silence within. I mean, it's so many ways that we can search to find that inner peace. And I mean, we are in a world that nothing can be quietly shut because everything makes noises. But I think when you forget about yourself and connect with that, I feel like I connect with the wind, I connect with the sunbathe when I'm bathing in the sun, and just, it's just the nature, the balance, the harmony of nature by itself. It sort of create this kind of harmony.
3 here.
Second.
Yes. Anyway, that's basically my own experience. That's what I think is a way to be silenced.
Thank you, Maluka. Yeah, I think it's early morning when I go for a walk here. I mean, I listen to the birds. It's just unbelievable. They are so loud. The earlier you get up, the better. And they're out there they are in charge. I think humans, they don't care about any of us. They are so happy out there. You know, we have a lot of mockingbirds here. I don't see any robins here. It was the Midwest where I'd see the robins. Here I see mockingbirds. And they are so beautiful songbirds. They're mimicking everybody. And it's beautiful in the morning with the morning doves and the mockingbirds and all of them out there. It's beautiful. And that's a wonderful time to forget everything, right? Yeah. Yeah, it does help.
Well, oh, go ahead.
I said to a certain extent, right? And then we get back to the routine. Right?
It looks like our time is up, but Ken has one more question. Can you take a question from Ken? Go for it. Or a comment.
Who?
Where'd you go?
I'm muted here. There we go. Yeah, the other day, Shobha, in the Gita workshop, we were talking about the Vaishnavism and the Shaivism. And the two female saints are in the Vishnu category. But were those the ones that looked at, we're talking about idolatry versus abstract imagery. So which of those two, again, is it the physical form or the statues of gods, and which is the form that was more abstract?
Well, it's interesting. They call it the Vaishnava tradition. But then I think when you talk about Krishna, when you talk about Krishna consciousness, all that doesn't, that's just the exterior aspect of some of the way in which it is practiced, Ken. However, when you talk about people like the saints, they are beyond all that, right? They are not talking about externalities. When we talk about or Andal, they have gone beyond all that. It's not the physical. But I was just talking about the externalities. For example, the Catholic faith has a lot of rituals in them. The Protestant faith doesn't do all that, right? It's the same thing in the Shaivite versus the Vaishnavite. They're all the same, you know. Ultimately, it's just they like to bicker amongst themselves. It's just this fun bickering that they do within them, saying we are more superior. What does it matter? None of them are Mirabais or Andals, right? They haven't reached that stage.
Okay, so they're at the other, sort of like the exoteric and the esoteric, you might say.
Right.
Well,
So
thank
it
you.
really doesn't matter. The Vaishnava or the Shaiva tradition, they all roads lead to, you know, like they say Rome, all roads lead to Nirvana, right? You can go the Shaivite way, you can go the Vaishnavite way, you can go the Catholic, you know, whatever, Jesus, whoever you know, you are, has been your path, you know, the path, you know, the final point is the same, but the path may vary, right?
Yes, very much. Well, thank you so much again. Appreciate it.
But Jim wants to get one more thing in there.
Yeah, I just want to mention, so that's just so, to me, just so brilliant, Shobha, because when we were talking, when someone brought up, yes, the question about silence. And I remembered right away Gandhi's vow of silence and his practice of it on a rather regular basis, having a day of silence where he could only write things out. But I also remember the Seneca saying, whenever I enter into public and return, I'm a lesser human being. Because we say things in public that later on in reflection we regret. Excess, deficiency, whatever it happens to be. So this notion that you brought forth, well, what about the vow of silence when you're with other people and basically what you're doing is listening? That to me is just such a powerful point in relation to the voluble and volatile parliaments we have throughout the world and people interacting with each other, not knowing how to pause, not knowing how to exercise restraint. And the kind of the language of silence through expression, through the eyes, through tonality, through just the attentiveness. All of these are beautiful expressions, sculpting of silence. And I think that's just really brilliant to bring that in. Vow of silence means deep listening to other people. And it just, in terms of the question about, well, what about mental chatter? It's interesting because also you referred to, and I just want to honor this. Look, mental chatter is just that. But if a person pauses the mental chatter and puts the mind on contemplating something as a deliberate act, mental act, I'm going to contemplate this beautiful, lovely abstract theme, then you're not mental chattering. Then you're trying to, in a pellucid way, actually take time to reflect on the meaning and possible meanings of something. That is a form of silence because it shows reverence and respect for what you're actually entertaining with the mind. It's not chatter. It's thinking clearly, thinking out, and seeing the possible implications, as philosophers say. And when you do that, you're creating spaces within the mind. And when you come to an understanding of something, there's a natural pause. There's a natural sense of completion. There's a natural sense of enjoyment. And so we have a sense of what comes of the fruit of silence is insight. And so you have both the be deep listener and then listen to the deeper aspect of your own mind and consciousness.
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks, Jim. I agree. I call that meditative contemplation.
Yeah,
I do both.
that makes sense. That makes sense.
Meditative contemplation. Wow. Well, gosh, Shobha, you did it again. Thank you very, very much. And so what a wonderful meeting. And I really look forward also to next week. Speaking of these themes that are themes for meditation and contemplation, friendship in a world of flux. Think about that. The deep dimensions of friendship, which I think we've all experienced today. So